Behind the golden gates of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries of tradition dictated every breath and gesture, a single moment would shatter the careful balance of power forever. It wasn't the clash of swords or the thunder of revolution that would reshape the monarchy. It was three words spoken in a voice that had never before defied the woman who controlled the throne from the shadows. Enough, Mother Camilla. The silence that followed would echo through marble halls and velvet chambers, marking the day when King Charles finally chose his wife over the woman who had shaped his entire reign. But some victories come at a price steeper than anyone could imagine. And in the world of crowns and conspiracies, even love can become a weapon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Persian rugs of the Queen Mother's private sitting room, but the warmth never seemed to reach the corners where Camilla Blackwood held court. At 68, she possessed the kind of regal bearing that made grown ministers stumble over their words and seasoned diplomats second-guess their every gesture. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing, especially not the way her daughter-in-law's hands trembled as she poured tea from the priceless Sèvres porcelain set. Catherine Elizabeth Blackwood, known to the world simply as Kate, had learned long ago that Tuesday mornings belonged to Camilla. These weren't mere social calls or family visits. They were interrogations disguised as tea time, performance reviews wrapped in the silk of tradition. For 7 years, since her marriage to Crown Prince Charles had elevated her from commoner to future queen, Kate had endured these weekly sessions with the grace expected of royalty and the inner strength of a woman who had clawed her way up from a middle-class background. "Your posture at the Children's Hospital opening was acceptable," Camilla said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Though I noticed you bent down to speak with that little girl in the wheelchair. We've discussed this, Catherine. Royal protocol dictates maintaining appropriate distance." Kate's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her teacup handle. "She was 7 years old, Your Majesty. She'd been waiting hours to meet me." "And she met you, didn't she? That should have been sufficient." Camilla's smile was thin as paper. "The photographers captured every angle of your informality. The tabloids will have a field day with those images, mark my words." "Princess Kate breaks protocol again. Is that the headline you want representing our family?" The accusation hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Kate had heard variations of this criticism countless times before. Too warm with the public, too accessible, too human. In Camilla's world, the monarchy survived by maintaining mystique, by remaining just out of reach enough to seem divine rather than ordinary. Every spontaneous gesture, every unscripted moment of genuine emotion was seen as a crack in the carefully constructed facade. "The children's wing received its largest donation in history the day after my visit," Kate said quietly, meeting her mother-in-law's gaze with steady green eyes. "Sometimes connection matters more than perfection." Camilla set down her cup with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke volumes. "Connection, you say? How wonderfully naive. Let me share something with you, my dear Catherine. Something that perhaps your humble origins haven't taught you. The monarchy doesn't survive on love. It survives on respect, on fear, on the careful maintenance of an image that places us above the common rabble. When you crawl on the floor with sick children, when you hug grieving mothers, when you cry at memorial services, you're not showing compassion. You're showing weakness." The words struck Kate like physical blows, but she'd learned to absorb Camilla's cruelty without flinching. 7 years had taught her that reaction only fed the older woman's appetite for psychological warfare. Instead, she focused on the portrait hanging above Camilla's head, a stern-faced ancestor who'd ruled during the War of the Roses, when the price of weakness had been measured in blood rather than headlines. "Charles seems to appreciate my approach," Kate said, proud that her voice remained level despite the storm building in her chest. "Charles." Camilla's laugh was like ice cracking. "My son has many admirable qualities, Catherine, but strength of character has never been among them. He's been coddled his entire life, protected from the harsh realities of rule by those of us wise enough to make the difficult decisions. He sees you smile at a crowd and thinks it's charming. He doesn't understand that every smile chips away at the reverence our people should feel when they look upon their future queen." Kate felt something shift inside her chest. A small flame of anger that she'd kept carefully banked for years. Perhaps respect earned through kindness is stronger than respect demanded through distance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Camilla's pale eyes narrowed to crystalline slits, and for a moment Kate glimpsed the iron will that had helped this woman survive 4 decades in a court notorious for destroying those it deemed unworthy. Camilla had clawed her way from minor nobility to the highest echelons of power through sheer determination and ruthless intelligence.
She hadn't done it by being kind.
"Kindness," Camilla repeated the word, as if it tasted bitter. How refreshingly middle-class of you. Tell me, Catherine, what do you think happens to kind monarchs? Shall I regale you with tales of Mary Queen of Scots, who was too trusting, or perhaps Louis XVI, who was too gentle? History is littered with the corpses of rulers who mistook kindness for strength. Kate's training kicked in automatically, the years of deportment lessons, of learning to school her features into pleasant neutrality even when her soul was screaming. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way Camilla had dismissed Charles so casually, or maybe it was simply the accumulation of 7 years' worth of these verbal assassinations. Whatever it was, Kate found herself speaking words she'd never dared voice before. And what about the rulers who were too cold, too removed from their people's suffering? The French Revolution didn't happen because Marie Antoinette was too kind, Your Majesty. It happened because she was too distant. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ornate clock on the mantelpiece seemed to hold its breath. Camilla's face underwent a transformation that Kate had witnessed only once before, during a private audience with a foreign dignitary who'd had the audacity to suggest that the kingdom's policies toward refugees were unnecessarily harsh. It was the look of a predator that had just been challenged by prey it had assumed was harmless. "How dare you?" Camilla's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have managed. "How dare you speak to me about revolution, about the responsibilities of rule, when you've never had to make a single difficult decision in your pampered little life? You think your charity work and your hospital visits make you qualified to lecture me about leadership?" Kate's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Camilla could hear it, but she pressed on. "I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps there's more than one way to serve the crown." "There is only one way." Camilla rose from her chair with fluid grace, her full height making her even more imposing. "My way. The way that has kept this monarchy stable for 40 years while other royal houses across Europe crumbled into irrelevance. The way that will continue long after you've learned your place or been replaced by someone more suitable." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd orchestrated the downfall of others before. Kate had heard whispers about Camilla's previous daughters-in-law, about the convenient scandals that had ended those marriages, about the way inconvenient truths had a habit of surfacing in the press whenever someone crossed the Queen Mother. She'd always assumed the stories were exaggerated, products of palace gossip and courtly paranoia. Now, looking into Camilla's eyes, she wasn't so sure. "I understand you perfectly, Your Majesty," Kate said, rising as well. "But I think you should understand something, too. I'm not going anywhere." The challenge was thrown down between them like a gauntlet, and Kate could see Camilla's mind already working, calculating angles and possibilities, weighing options for dealing with this unexpected rebellion. The older woman had built her power base carefully over the decades, cultivating relationships with key courtiers, influential media figures, and political leaders who owed their positions to her subtle manipulations. She controlled information flow, access to the royal family, and most importantly, she controlled Charles. But Kate had advantages too. Advantages that Camilla had perhaps underestimated. The public adored her in a way they hadn't loved a royal family member since Charles's grandmother. Her charity work wasn't just photo opportunities. She built genuine relationships with organizations that commanded respect across political lines. And Charles, despite his mother's dismissive words, had grown stronger over their 7 years of marriage, more confident in his own judgment. "We shall see," Camilla said finally, her smile returning but now edged with something predatory. "We shall see indeed, my dear Catherine." As Kate left the Queen Mother's sitting room, her legs surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, she had no idea that their conversation had been overheard. In the adjacent room, separated only by a door left slightly ajar, Prince Charles had arrived early for his own weekly audience with his mother. He'd heard every word, every threat, every casual dismissal of his character, and for the first time in his 45 years of life, he'd heard his wife defend not just herself but him. The man who would one day rule a kingdom stood in the shadows of his mother's palace, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and made a decision that would change everything. The time for choosing sides had finally come. Prince Charles Blackwood had always understood that his life belonged to the crown before it belonged to him. Born into a world of predetermined paths and ancient obligations, he'd learned early that personal desires were luxuries that future kings couldn't afford. For 45 years, he'd walked the careful line between duty and conscience, between his mother's iron expectations and his own quietly burning need to matter beyond mere ceremony. But standing outside his mother's sitting room, listening to Kate defend their marriage while Camilla casually discussed replacing her, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of where duty truly lay. He'd arrived early for their scheduled meeting, intending to discuss the upcoming state visit from the Meridian Islands delegation, a delicate diplomatic dance that required careful choreography. Instead, he'd stumbled into a war zone where his wife's dignity was under assault and his own character was being dissected with surgical precision. The Charles that Camilla described, weak, coddled, lacking in judgment, bore little resemblance to the man he'd worked to become over the past 7 years. Kate's influence had done that, had helped him find his own voice in a world that had always spoken for him. Now, as he listened to Kate's heels clicking down the marble corridor, each step echoing his wife's quiet courage, Charles made a choice that terrified and liberated him in equal measure. He would not wait to be summoned. He would not knock and request permission to enter. For the first time in his adult life, he would walk into his mother's domain as her equal, not her subject. The sitting room door opened with more force than protocol suggested, causing Camilla to look up from her papers with raised eyebrows. She was already resettling into her routine, no doubt planning her next move against Kate with the methodical precision of a chess grandmaster. The sight of her casual confidence, her complete certainty that she just won another skirmish in a war Kate didn't even know she was fighting, ignited something in Charles that he'd kept carefully buried for decades.
"Mother," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made Camilla pause in her paper shuffling.
"We need to talk. Charles, darling, you're early." Her smile was warm, practiced, the same expression she'd worn when he was 7 years old and confessing to breaking a priceless vase.
I was just finishing my correspondence.
The Meridian delegation's dietary requirements are quite specific, and
"I heard you."
the words cut through her diplomatic chatter like a blade. Every word you said to Kate, every threat you made. Camilla's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something sharp and calculating beneath the maternal mask. Then, like water finding its level, she regained her equilibrium with decades of practiced ease. "Threat? My dear boy, I think you may have misunderstood. Catherine and I were simply having a discussion about royal protocol. You told her she could be replaced." Charles stepped further into the room, and for the first time, Camilla had to look up at him instead of down. "You spoke about her as if she were a piece of furniture that wasn't quite the right style for the room. I spoke to her about reality." Camilla's voice took on the patient tone she'd used when explaining complex political situations to him as a child. "The same reality I've spent 40 years protecting you from. Catherine is charming, I'll grant you that. The people adore her common touch, her accessibility. But charm doesn't make a queen, Charles. Strength does. Wisdom does. The ability to make hard choices does." Charles had heard variations of this speech his entire life. Hard choices, difficult decisions, the burden of the crown that only those born to it could truly understand. But today, after listening to Kate defend both their marriage and his character while facing down the most formidable woman in the kingdom, those familiar phrases rang hollow. "Tell me about these hard choices, Mother," he said, settling into the chair Kate had vacated, still warm from her presence. "Tell me about the difficult decisions you've made on my behalf." Something flickered in Camilla's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or approval at this unexpected display of backbone. "Where shall I begin? The trade agreements that keep our economy stable while other nations flounder? The careful diplomatic relationships that ensure our allies remain loyal? The media strategies that have kept this family's reputation intact despite numerous scandals over the years? What about Diana?" The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the careful atmosphere Camilla had cultivated. Diana Ashworth had been Charles's first wife, a bright, impulsive girl from a prominent family who'd captured the public's imagination and Charles's heart in equal measure. Their marriage had lasted 3 tumultuous years before ending in a divorce that had dominated headlines for months. "What about her?" Camilla's voice was steady, but Charles caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "The photographs," Charles continued, his own voice growing stronger with each word, "the ones that showed her in what appeared to be a compromising position with her riding instructor. Very convenient timing, considering I just told you I was thinking of defying your wishes about the succession laws." "Diana made her own choices, Charles. I merely ensured that those choices became public knowledge. Would you have preferred I allowed her to make a fool of you privately while she conducted her affair in secret?" The casual admission hit Charles like a physical blow. He'd suspected, of course. In the years since Diana's exile to a countryside estate, he'd pieced together enough fragments to form a disturbing picture. But hearing Camilla confess to orchestrating his first wife's downfall with such matter-of-fact calm was somehow worse than his darkest imaginings. "She wasn't having an affair," he said quietly. "The photographs were staged." "Were they? How interesting that you should think so." Camilla's smile was knife-thin. "Tell me, darling, what evidence do you have of such a dramatic claim?" Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope that he'd been carrying for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to confront his mother with its contents. Inside were photographs, the originals of the images that had destroyed Diana's reputation, along with payment records and correspondence that told a very different story than the one the press had been fed. James Morrison, Charles said, placing the evidence on the table between them, the riding instructor. Interesting man. After Diana left, he moved to Australia with enough money to buy a horse ranch. He was quite willing to discuss his brief employment at Ashworth Estate when my investigators finally tracked him down. Camilla's face remained impassive, but Charles could see her mind working, calculating how much he knew and how much damage control would be necessary. It was the same look she wore during particularly challenging parliamentary sessions, when she had to navigate between competing interests while protecting the Crown's reputation. You had my wife photographed in staged scenarios with a man you paid to seduce her, Charles continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Then you released those photographs to the press at precisely the moment when public support for my position on succession reform was reaching its peak. Diana's divorce wasn't the result of her infidelity, Mother. It was the result of your political calculations. Your wife was weak, Camilla said, finally dropping the pretense of maternal concern. She would have dragged this monarchy down with her idealistic nonsense about opening the palace to common visitors and her ridiculous campaign for education reform. Can you imagine the chaos if we'd allowed every school child in the kingdom to tour the royal quarters? The security nightmares alone would have bankrupted us. She wanted to make the monarchy relevant to ordinary people. She wanted to prove that we served them, not the other way around. Exactly. Camilla leaned forward, her pale eyes bright with conviction. She wanted to turn us into a tourist attraction, a quaint historical curiosity that people could gawk at on weekends. Diana never understood that mystery equals majesty, Charles. The moment we become accessible, we become ordinary. And ordinary things can be discarded when they're no longer useful. The conversation was spiraling toward territory that Charles had avoided for years, toward questions about the very nature of their role in a modern world that increasingly questioned the value of hereditary power. But today, with Kate's courage still echoing in his memory, he found himself willing to traverse that dangerous ground. Perhaps ordinary isn't the enemy you think it is, he said. Perhaps connecting with our people's ordinary struggles and dreams is exactly what the Crown needs to survive the next century. Survive? Camilla's laugh was sharp as breaking glass.
My dear boy, we don't survive by adapting to changing times.
We survive by remaining constant while everything else changes around us. We are the rock upon which this nation's stability rests. Start chipping away at that rock, and everything comes tumbling down. Charles thought about Kate's work with homeless shelters, about the way she'd revolutionized the children's hospital charity by actually spending time with patients instead of simply posing for photographs. He thought about the letters they received from ordinary citizens, thanking them not for their titles or their bloodline, but for seeing them as human beings worthy of royal attention.
What if you're wrong? He asked.
What if the rock isn't our distance from the people, but our connection to them? What if the Crown's strength comes not from being above human concerns, but from understanding them better than anyone else? For the first time in their conversation, Camilla looked genuinely taken aback. This wasn't the Charles she'd raised, the dutiful son who accepted her wisdom without question. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd been shaped by influences she hadn't controlled and perspectives she hadn't approved. It was, she realized with growing alarm, exactly what she'd feared Kate might accomplish. You're starting to sound like your wife, she said, and the words carried the weight of accusation. Good, Charles replied, standing from his chair with a decisiveness that surprised them both. Because my wife is the wisest person I know, and if you continue to attack her, to undermine her, to treat her as some replaceable ornament in your grand design, you'll discover exactly how much I've learned from her about standing up for what matters. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, decades of careful power dynamics suddenly shifting like tectonic plates. Camilla had controlled her son's life for so long that the idea of him actively opposing her will seemed almost impossible to process. Yet here he stood, shoulders straight and eyes bright with newfound resolve, looking more like the king he would someday become than ever before. You would choose her over your family? Camilla asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I would choose her over your version of family, Charles corrected, because Kate has shown me what family actually means. Loyalty that uplifts instead of controls. Support that empowers instead of diminishes. Love that trusts instead of manipulates. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving his mother alone with her carefully constructed world of protocols and political calculations. But as his hand touched the doorknob, her voice stopped him with words that chilled his blood. You have no idea what you're choosing, Charles, or what you're giving up, but you will. Oh, you certainly will. The palace corridors seemed longer than usual as Charles walked toward his private study, his mind churning with the implications of what had just transpired. For the first time in his life, he directly challenged his mother's authority, and the weight of that rebellion sat heavy on his shoulders. Yet beneath the anxiety and uncertainty there was something else, a lightness he hadn't felt since childhood, the peculiar freedom that comes from finally speaking a truth that's been buried too long. Kate was waiting for him in their shared study, a spacious room lined with books and warmed by afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. She'd changed from her formal morning attire into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and she was curled in the window seat with a cup of tea and a stack of letters from various charities. This was the Kate that Camilla never saw, relaxed, unguarded, genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with royal styling or public presentation. "How did your meeting go?" she asked without looking up from the letter she was reading. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Charles could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the teacup just a little too tightly. "It was illuminating," Charles said, settling into the chair opposite her. "I learned quite a bit about family loyalty and the price of speaking one's mind." Kate's eyes finally met his, and in them he could see the careful composure beginning to crack. "She was particularly charming this morning. I think I may have finally pushed her past the point of polite hostility into something more direct." Charles reached across the space between them and took her hand, noting the slight tremor in her fingers. "Tell me what she said to you." "All of it." For the next 20 minutes, Kate recounted her conversation with Camilla, from the criticism about her hospital visit to the thinly veiled threats about replacement and the casual dismissal of Charles's character. With each revelation, Charles felt his anger building. Not the hot, explosive kind that burned itself out quickly, but the cold, steady fury that came from watching someone you love being systematically torn down by someone who claimed to act out of family loyalty. "She's afraid," he said when Kate finished her account. "For all her talk about strength and difficult decisions, she's terrified of losing control. And she should be, because things are about to change dramatically around here." Kate set down her teacup and studied her husband's face. In 7 years of marriage, she'd seen him angry before. At incompetent ministers, at media intrusions, at the countless small injustices that royal life seemed to generate. But this was different. There was a steel in his expression that she'd never seen before, a sense of resolve that seemed to have crystallized into something unshakable. "What did you do?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Charles told her about confronting his mother, about the evidence he'd presented regarding Diana's manufactured scandal, about the ultimatum he'd delivered. With each detail, Kate's eyes grew wider, not with fear, but with something approaching awe. She'd married a kind, well-meaning man who'd been raised to defer to stronger personalities. Somewhere along the way, without her quite realizing it, that man had transformed into someone willing to stand against the most powerful woman in the kingdom for the sake of what was right. "You defended me," she said softly, as if testing the words to make sure they were real. "I defended us," Charles corrected. "Our marriage, our values, our right to define what kind of royal family we want to be. Camilla may have 40 years of experience in palace politics, but she's been fighting the wrong war. While she's been focused on controlling information and manipulating perceptions, the world has changed around her. People don't want mysterious, untouchable monarchs anymore, Kate. They want leaders they can respect and relate to." Kate felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether they were from relief, gratitude, or simple, overwhelming emotion, she couldn't say. For 7 years, she'd fought her battles with Camilla alone, absorbing each criticism and weathering each subtle attack with the stoic grace expected of royal wives. The knowledge that Charles not only understood her struggle, but was willing to join it transformed something fundamental in their relationship. "She won't just accept this," Kate warned, her practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional moment. "Your mother doesn't lose gracefully, and she has resources we haven't even begun to understand. If we're really doing this, if we're really challenging her control, we need to be prepared for war." Charles nodded grimly. "I know, which is why we need allies, and we need them quickly. Camilla's power base isn't as solid as she'd like us to believe. There are plenty of people in this palace and beyond who've grown tired of her methods, who've been waiting for someone to finally stand up to her. Over the next 2 hours, they developed what could only be described as a battle plan. Charles's private secretary, Margaret Thompson, had served the royal family for 15 years and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Camilla's behind-the-scenes manipulations. The head of palace security, Colonel James Wright, was a career military man who valued honor above politics and had never quite trusted the Queen Mother's relationship with certain media figures. Even among the household staff, there were murmurs of discontent about the atmosphere of fear that Camilla maintained through her network of informants and enforcers. "What about external support?" Kate asked, her strategic mind already working through possibilities. "The press has been largely favorable to us, especially after the children's hospital renovations. And the opposition parties have always preferred our approach to royal duties over your mother's more traditional methods." Charles pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "Lord Harrison owes me several favors from the trade negotiations last year. Lady Morrison's always been a supporter of your charity work. And then there's Thomas Ashford at the Telegraph. He's been investigating some of Camilla's media relationships for months, though he's never had quite enough evidence to publish." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Margaret Thompson entered with her usual efficient grace, but Kate could see the concern in the older woman's eyes. As Charles's private secretary, Margaret had an uncanny ability to sense shifts in palace dynamics, and the tension from that morning's confrontations would have been impossible to miss. "Your Royal Highness," she said, addressing Charles with formal deference despite their long working relationship, "I'm afraid there have been some developments that require your immediate attention." Charles gestured for her to continue, and Margaret glanced nervously at Kate before speaking. "The Queen Mother has called an emergency meeting of the Royal Council for this evening. All senior staff plus representatives from the Prime Minister's office and the Archbishop of Canterbury." She's citing concerns about stability and succession planning. The implications hit both Charles and Kate simultaneously. The Royal Council was reserved for moments of genuine crisis. Death of monarchs, constitutional emergencies, threats to the stability of the crown itself. For Camilla to invoke it now, barely hours after her confrontation with Charles, suggested she was escalating far beyond what either of them had anticipated. "What's the stated agenda?" Kate asked, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Margaret consulted her tablet, Royal Conduct Protocols, Assessment of Public Relations Strategies, and Evaluation of Current Royal Marriage Stability. The last item on the agenda was clearly aimed at Kate, a formal challenge to her position as future queen, disguised as administrative housekeeping. It was a masterful political maneuver, forcing the question of Kate's suitability into an official forum where Camilla would have home field advantage and weeks to prepare her arguments. Charles would be put in the position of defending his wife's worthiness to a council of advisors who had been carefully selected over the years for their loyalty to traditional approaches. "She's moving faster than we expected," Charles said grimly, "which means we need to move faster too." He turned to Margaret with the kind of authority she'd rarely heard from him before. "I need you to contact Lord Harrison, Lady Morrison, and Bishop Clement immediately. Tell them I'm requesting their presence at tonight's council meeting as additional advisors. Use whatever diplomatic language necessary, but make it clear this isn't a request they can decline." Margaret nodded, already making notes on her tablet. "What about the media situation, sir? There have been some unusual inquiries from several outlets about palace dynamics and succession planning. Someone is definitely leaking information." Kate and Charles exchanged glances. They both knew who that someone was likely to be. Camilla had cultivated relationships with key journalists for decades, trading access and exclusive information for favorable coverage and strategic narrative control. If she was activating those relationships now, it meant she was prepared to take their family conflict public in ways that could damage the monarchy itself. "Get Thomas Ashford on the phone," Charles instructed. "Tell him I'm prepared to discuss some of those media relationships he's been investigating. Full cooperation, exclusive access, the works. It's time the public understood exactly how their news about the royal family has been manufactured." As Margaret hurried out to execute his orders, Charles turned back to Kate with an expression that mixed determination with something approaching fear. "Are you ready for this? Because once we walk into that council chamber tonight, there's no going back. We'll either emerge as partners in reshaping this monarchy, or Camilla will have destroyed both our reputations so thoroughly that stepping down might be our only option." Kate thought about her conversation with Camilla that morning, about 7 years of careful humiliations and strategic undermining, about the casual way the Queen Mother had discussed replacing her, as if she were an unsatisfactory employee. Then she thought about the children at the hospital, about the letters from grateful families, about the possibility of using her position to actually make a difference in people's lives rather than simply maintaining an image. "I've been ready for 7 years," she said, standing and smoothing her dress with hands that no longer trembled. "The question is whether the rest of them are ready for us." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across their study, Kate and Charles continued planning their strategy for the evening's confrontation. Neither of them spoke about the very real possibility that they were about to trigger a crisis that could reshape or destroy the institution they'd been born and married to serve. But both understood that some battles couldn't be avoided forever, and sometimes the only way to save something worth preserving was to risk losing it entirely. The Game of Thrones that had been playing out in whispered conversations and private meetings was about to become very public indeed. And in the marble halls of Ravencrest Palace, the outcome would determine not just the fate of one marriage, but the future of a monarchy that was about to discover whether it could survive its own transformation. The Royal Council Chamber had witnessed history in the making for over 3 centuries. Kings had been advised, queens had been challenged, and the fate of nations had been decided within its oak-paneled walls. Tonight, as Charles and Kate walked through its heavy doors, they could feel the weight of that history pressing down on them like a physical force. The chamber's formal grandeur, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished mahogany, portraits of long-dead monarchs watching from gilt frames, seemed designed to remind everyone present of their small place in a much larger story. Camilla had positioned herself at the head of the massive table with the strategic precision of a general choosing her battlefield. To her right sat Archbishop Clement Morrison, whose stern features and white collar lent moral authority to whatever pronouncements might follow. To her left was Lord Chancellor Harrison, a shrewd political operator, whose loyalty had been purchased through decades of carefully distributed favors and strategic appointments. The rest of the council filled out the table in order of precedence and allegiance, with Camilla's supporters clustering near the center of power and potential allies relegated to the periphery. Charles had managed to secure the presence of 3 additional advisors, but their placement at the far end of the table made their outsider status obvious to everyone in the room. Lady Morrison, one of the kingdom's most respected legal minds and a longtime advocate for constitutional reform, sat with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. Bishop Clement, representing the more progressive wing of the established church, maintained an expression of careful neutrality that fooled no one. Lord Harrison, whose military background had taught him to recognize tactical situations, surveyed the room with the watchful eyes of a man expecting ambush. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice," Camilla began, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone completely comfortable in her role as ultimate decision-maker. "The matters we must discuss tonight concern the very foundation of our monarchy's stability and its ability to serve the people of this kingdom effectively." Kate felt Charles's hand brush hers under the table, a small gesture of solidarity that helped steady her nerves. She'd spent the hours before this meeting preparing for various lines of attack, but the formal setting and official nature of the proceedings made everything feel more momentous than she'd anticipated. This wasn't another private confrontation that could be contained within family walls. This was her public trial, conducted before witnesses whose opinions would shape the monarchy's future direction. "Recent events have raised serious questions about the direction of our royal family's public engagement," Camilla continued, her pale eyes moving deliberately around the table to make contact with each council member. "While change and adaptation are sometimes necessary, we must ensure that any modifications to our traditional approaches serve the crown's long-term interests rather than short-term popularity." Lord Chancellor Harrison leaned forward slightly, his political instincts already sensing the currents in the room. "Your Majesty, could you be more specific about which events or approaches have caused concern?" It was a careful question designed to draw Camilla into specifics without appearing to take sides. But Kate recognized it as the opening gambit in what was essentially a formal investigation of her fitness for future queenship. Everything that followed would be analyzed, recorded, and potentially released to justify whatever decision the council ultimately reached. "Certainly," Camilla smiled, pulling out a leather portfolio that Kate realized with growing dread was thick with documentation. Over the past 18 months, there have been numerous instances where established royal protocols have been creatively interpreted in ways that may compromise the dignity and authority of the crown. What followed was a methodical dismantling of Kate's public work, presented with the kind of legal precision that turned acts of compassion into evidence of unfitness for royal duty. The hospital visit where she knelt to speak with sick children was reframed as a breach of security protocols that put her at unnecessary risk. A decision to invite disadvantaged families to a private palace garden party was characterized as a dangerous precedent that undermined the exclusive nature of royal access. Even her successful fundraising efforts were questioned, with Camilla suggesting that the aggressive solicitation of donations was undignified behavior for someone of her station. Furthermore, Camilla continued, her voice taking on a tone of reluctant duty, there have been concerning reports about the influence of these populist approaches on other members of the royal family. Traditional lines of authority and consultation have been bypassed in favor of more impulsive decision-making. Kate felt her cheeks burning as she realized Camilla was now attacking Charles through her, suggesting that his support for her work represented a fundamental weakness in his character and judgment. It was a masterful strategy. Instead of directly challenging the future king, Camilla was portraying him as a victim of his wife's misguided influence, someone who needed protection from his own generous nature. Charles's response surprised everyone in the room, including Kate. Instead of the defensive explanation they might have expected, he stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention as he looked directly at his mother. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying a new authority that seemed to echo off the chamber's ancient walls. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what's been happening in our family, and it's time for some clarity." The formal address was significant. By calling her mother instead of Your Majesty in this setting, Charles was subtly but unmistakably asserting his position as her son and heir rather than her subject. It was a small rebellion, but in the context of royal protocol, it carried the weight of revolution. "Please, Charles, sit down." Camilla's voice carried just a hint of strain. "This is a formal council session, not a family discussion."
No, I think it's exactly a family discussion.
Charles replied, remaining standing. "Because everything you've presented tonight is based on the assumption that Kate's approach to royal duty represents some kind of dangerous departure from tradition. But I want this council to understand something crucial. Her approach isn't a departure from tradition. It's a return to the best traditions of royal service." He gestured to the portraits lining the walls, his voice gaining strength with each word. Queen Victoria spent her later years visiting factories and speaking directly with working families. King Edward VII revolutionized royal diplomatic engagement by meeting personally with foreign leaders instead of conducting all business through intermediaries. Queen Elizabeth I made herself available to common petitioners every week, hearing their concerns and dispensing justice personally. Kate watched in amazement as Charles transformed the chamber's atmosphere through sheer force of historical knowledge and passionate conviction. He wasn't just defending her work. He was placing it within a grand tradition of royal engagement that Camilla's more distant approach had abandoned. "What Kate has done," Charles continued, "is remind us that the crown's power comes not from mystery or distance, but from genuine connection with the people we serve. When she kneels down to speak with a sick child, she's not compromising royal dignity. She's demonstrating that royal dignity means caring more about a child's comfort than about maintaining an arbitrary posture." Archbishop Morrison, who had been silent throughout Camilla's presentation, finally spoke up. "Your Royal Highness raises an interesting theological point. The concept of service through humility is certainly consistent with Christian principles of leadership." It was a carefully neutral statement, but in the context of the chamber's charged atmosphere, it felt like a crack in Camilla's wall of support. Other council members began shifting in their seats, glancing between Charles and his mother as they recalculated their positions. Lord Chancellor Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should hear from Princess Kate directly about her approach to royal duties and her vision for future engagement." Kate had been dreading this moment, but Charles's passionate defense had given her the courage she needed. She stood, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Thank you, Lord Chancellor. I want to be very clear about something that seems to have been lost in tonight's discussion. I didn't choose to marry into this family in order to change it, or to impose my own vision on centuries of tradition. I chose to marry Charles because I loved him, and because I believed in the possibility of using royal privilege to make a genuine difference in people's lives." She paused, making eye contact with each council member in turn. "But I've learned that there are two very different ideas about what that difference should look like. One approach sees the monarchy as a symbol that derives power from distance and mystery. The other sees it as an institution that derives legitimacy from service and connection." Kate pulled out her own folder, much thinner than Camilla's, but containing letters and testimonials that told a different story than the one that had dominated the evening's discussion. "These are letters from families whose lives have been touched by our work over the past 7 years. A mother whose child received experimental treatment because our hospital advocacy brought international attention to his rare condition. A veteran who found housing through our homelessness initiative. A young woman who started her own charity after meeting us at a youth engagement event." She set the folder on the table, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "This isn't about protocol or tradition or maintaining appropriate distance. This is about whether we want to be a monarchy that matters to people's actual lives, or one that exists primarily to preserve its own image." The chamber fell silent, and Kate could see council members wrestling with the fundamental question she'd posed. In the end, the choice wasn't really about her or Charles or even Camilla. It was about what kind of institution they wanted the monarchy to be in a world that increasingly questioned the relevance of hereditary power. Lady Morrison leaned forward, her legal mind cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Princess Kate, what would you say to those who argue that your approach, however well-intentioned, risks undermining the monarchy's constitutional position by making it too dependent on popular opinion? It was a fair question, and Kate had thought about it extensively during her years of navigating royal duty. I would say that constitutional monarchy has always depended on popular consent, Lady Morrison. The only question is whether that consent is maintained through fear and distance or through respect and demonstrated service. I believe our long-term stability depends on proving our relevance, not assuming it. The debate that followed was intense but civil, with council members asking pointed questions about security implications, constitutional precedents, and the practical challenges of maintaining royal dignity while increasing public access. But Kate could see that the fundamental dynamic in the room had shifted. Instead of defending herself against charges of undermining tradition, she and Charles were now leading a discussion about tradition's future evolution. Camilla remained largely silent during this phase, her pale eyes calculating as she watched her carefully planned trial transform into something she hadn't anticipated. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a cold finality that made everyone in the chamber pay attention. "This has been a fascinating discussion," she said, "but I think we're losing sight of practical realities. Constitutional monarchy isn't a democracy. It doesn't matter what the people want or think they want. It matters what serves the long-term stability of the crown and the nation. And that stability has been maintained for centuries through careful preservation of royal mystique and authority." She stood, her regal bearing commanding attention despite the way the evening's discussion had evolved beyond her control. "I've spent 40 years protecting this institution from the kind of popularizing impulses that have destroyed other royal houses across Europe. Proximity breeds contempt. Accessibility leads to exploitation. Emotional connection creates dangerous dependencies that can't be sustained across changes in personality or circumstance." Camilla's gaze fixed on Kate with laser intensity. "You speak beautifully about service and connection, my dear Catherine. But royal service isn't about making people feel good about themselves or giving them touching personal encounters with their future queen. Royal service is about making the hard decisions that elected politicians can't or won't make, about providing stability and continuity that transcends the passing enthusiasms of any particular moment." The Queen Mother's voice took on a tone of absolute certainty that had silenced opposition for decades. "What you call connection, I call dependency. What you call relevance, I call pandering. And what you call the future of the monarchy, I call the path to its destruction." The gauntlet was thrown down with unmistakable force, and Kate realized that this confrontation had moved far beyond questions of protocol or personal style. This was a battle for the soul of the institution itself, between two fundamentally incompatible visions of what royal power should mean in the modern world. Charles reached for Kate's hand openly, no longer caring about the political implications of public displays of solidarity. "Then we fundamentally disagree about the source of royal legitimacy, Mother, and this council will have to decide which vision serves the kingdom better." The chamber held its collective breath, understanding that they had just witnessed the formal declaration of a conflict that would reshape the monarchy forever. The only question now was which side would emerge victorious and what would be left of the institution they were all fighting to preserve. The Royal Council chamber had grown thick with tension as the evening wore on, but it was Lord Chancellor Harrison who finally broke the philosophical deadlock with the kind of pragmatic question that had made him indispensable to 3 generations of monarchs. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Camilla with careful deference, "while these questions of royal philosophy are certainly important, perhaps we should consider the immediate practical implications. The kingdom faces several pressing challenges: the trade negotiations with the Northern Alliance, the ongoing refugee crisis, the economic uncertainty following last month's banking scandal. How do our different approaches to royal engagement affect our ability to address these real-world concerns?" It was a masterful intervention, shifting the discussion from abstract principles to concrete governance in a way that forced everyone to consider actual outcomes rather than theoretical positions. Kate felt a surge of gratitude toward the Lord Chancellor, recognizing that he was providing her and Charles with an opportunity to demonstrate the practical value of their approach. "An excellent point," Charles said, seizing the opening. "Kate's work with the refugee resettlement program has generated unprecedented private sector support for integration initiatives. Her personal meetings with business leaders, community organizers, and affected families created a coalition that government officials had been trying to build for months without success." Kate nodded, grateful for Charles's support but ready to speak for herself. The Northern Alliance trade talks stalled last year because their representatives felt our delegation was too focused on abstract economic models and not enough on the human impact of proposed agreements. When I participated in the cultural exchange program and spent time with their agricultural communities, it opened communication channels that ultimately led to the current breakthrough in negotiations. She could see several council members nodding thoughtfully, remembering the favorable press coverage and diplomatic progress that had followed Kate's unconventional engagement with foreign communities. Even Archbishop Morrison, who had remained carefully neutral throughout the evening, seemed to be reconsidering his position, but Camilla wasn't finished. "These tactical successes," she said, her voice carrying the patient condescension of a professor correcting a promising but misguided student, "miss the larger strategic picture. Yes, Catherine's approach generates positive headlines and short-term diplomatic gains, but what happens when the novelty wears off? What happens when the public becomes accustomed to accessible royalty and begins demanding even greater intimacy? What happens when foreign leaders expect personal relationships with every member of our family?" She began pacing slowly around the table, her movement commanding attention as effectively as any theatrical performance. The strength of monarchy lies in its predictability, its stability across generations, in changing circumstances. When we make our effectiveness dependent on individual personality and charisma, we create a system that can't survive changes in leadership or shifts in public mood. Lady Morrison leaned forward with the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the kingdom's most respected legal minds. "But Your Majesty, isn't that exactly what we've been seeing across Europe? Traditional monarchies that maintain distance and mystique while becoming increasingly irrelevant to their people's actual lives. The Spanish throne barely survived the corruption scandals precisely because they had no reservoir of public goodwill to draw upon. The Norwegian royal family, by contrast, has grown more popular over time because of their active engagement with social issues." "The Norwegian royal family," Camilla replied with a thin smile, "presides over a small, homogeneous population with relatively simple governance challenges. We rule a diverse, complex nation with global responsibilities and centuries-old constitutional arrangements. What works for a family of 5 million doesn't necessarily scale to 50 million. Kate felt the conversation slipping into academic territory that played to Camilla's strengths. Abstract constitutional theory where the Queen Mother's decades of experience and encyclopedic knowledge of precedent gave her natural advantages. But then she remembered something that Charles had said earlier about the source of royal legitimacy, and she decided to take a risk. "Your Majesty," Kate said, standing and moving to the massive window that overlooked the palace courtyard, where even at this late hour, small groups of visitors could be seen taking photographs and talking excitedly about their proximity to royal history. "May I ask you a direct question about legitimacy?" Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly, but she gestured for Kate to continue. "Where do you believe the monarchy's right to rule ultimately comes from? Divine appointment? Historical precedent? Constitutional tradition?" It was a dangerous question, one that could easily be turned against Kate if she wasn't careful. But she pressed on, her voice gaining confidence as she developed her argument. "Because I believe it comes from consent. Not the kind of formal one-time consent that's given through constitutional conventions, but the ongoing daily consent of people who choose to respect royal authority because they believe it serves their interests and reflects their values." Kate turned back to face the table, her green eyes bright with conviction. "Every interaction I have with a sick child, every conversation with a struggling family, every moment when I choose to see people as individuals rather than subjects, those aren't departures from royal tradition, they're investments in the ongoing relationship between crown and people that makes monarchy possible in a democratic age." She moved back to her seat but remained standing. "The trade negotiations succeeded not because I charmed foreign representatives, but because I demonstrated that our royal family understands and cares about the real impact of policy decisions on real people's lives. That understanding made our negotiating position stronger because it made our commitment more credible." Bishop Clement, who had been silent for much of the evening, finally spoke with the moral authority that his position afforded. "Princess Kate raises an important theological point about service and leadership. In Christian tradition, authority derives its legitimacy from service to those under that authority. A leader who becomes disconnected from the struggles and hopes of their people has abandoned the very foundation of their right to lead." The bishop's intervention carried special weight because of his reputation for theological conservatism and his long-standing relationship with the royal family. For him to support Kate's position represented a significant shift in the religious establishment's stance, and Kate could see several council members recalculating their positions in response. Charles seized the moment to press their advantage. "This isn't about choosing between tradition and innovation," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a future king who had finally found his voice. This is about choosing between a tradition that's alive and growing and one that's become a museum piece. Kate hasn't abandoned royal dignity. She's redefined it for an age when dignity means engagement rather than distance. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each council member in turn. And frankly, the results speak for themselves. Our approval ratings are at their highest levels in decades. International respect for our diplomatic capabilities has never been stronger. The charitable sector has seen unprecedented growth in both funding and volunteer participation. If this is failure, I'd like to see what success looks like. Lord Chancellor Harrison consulted his notes before speaking carefully. Your Royal Highness, while the public opinion data certainly supports your position, there are concerns about long-term sustainability. Can this level of personal engagement be maintained across decades? What happens during inevitable periods of personal crisis, illness, or family difficulty? It was a fair question, and Kate appreciated Harrison's willingness to engage with practical challenges rather than simply defending philosophical positions. That's exactly why we need to build institutional changes, not just personal approaches, she replied. The goal isn't to make the monarchy dependent on any individual's charisma or energy. The goal is to create systems and traditions that prioritize genuine service across different personalities and circumstances. She pulled out her phone and displayed a series of photographs that she'd been sharing on social media, images of royal staff volunteering at charity events, of palace facilities being used for community meetings, of formal royal protocols being adapted to accommodate disabled visitors and international guests from different cultural traditions. We've been working to democratize royal service throughout our household, Kate continued. Training staff in community engagement, opening palace resources to educational and charitable use, creating mentorship programs that connect royal experience with young community leaders. The personal connection is just the beginning. The real change is systemic. Camilla had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, recognizing that Kate and Charles had moved far beyond the defensive position she'd expected to find them in. Instead of justifying individual decisions, they were presenting a comprehensive alternative vision of monarchy that directly challenged everything she'd built over 4 decades of careful control. Enough, she said finally, her voice cutting through the discussion with absolute authority. This has gone far beyond questions of protocol or engagement strategy. What you're describing, Catherine, isn't reform of the monarchy. It's revolution, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy an institution that has survived for 1,000 years. She stood, her full height and regal bearing commanding attention, even as her face showed the strain of an evening that had spiraled completely beyond her control. You speak about consent and service and connection, as if these are new concepts, as if previous generations of monarchs were simply too ignorant or selfish to discover these obvious truths. But what you're really describing is the abdication of royal authority in favor of popular opinion. Camilla's voice grew stronger, taking on the tone she'd used during some of the most challenging political crises of her career. A monarchy that depends on popularity becomes hostage to public mood. A crown that seeks approval becomes a toy of whoever can most effectively manipulate public sentiment. You think you're strengthening the institution, but you're actually making it more vulnerable than it's ever been. She moved to the portraits lining the chamber walls, gesturing toward the stern faces of long-dead monarchs who had navigated wars, plagues, and political upheavals while maintaining royal authority. These rulers survived because they understood something you've forgotten. Leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions for long-term stability. It requires maintaining authority even when,
Especially when,
that authority is challenged or questioned. Kate felt the weight of Camilla's argument, understanding that it wasn't motivated by mere power hunger or resistance to change. The Queen Mother genuinely believed that accessibility would lead to vulnerability, that emotional connection would undermine the psychological distance necessary for effective rule. It was a coherent worldview, one that had successfully guided the monarchy through decades of social and political turbulence. But it was also, Kate realized, a worldview based on fear rather than confidence in the monarchy's essential value to modern society.
Your Majesty, Kate said quietly, I understand your concerns about vulnerability and long-term stability.
But I think you're underestimating both the strength of our institution and the wisdom of our people. The monarchy hasn't survived for 1,000 years by remaining static. It survived by adapting while preserving what's truly essential. She gestured toward the same portraits Camilla had indicated. Those rulers faced challenges we can barely imagine. Foreign invasions, religious wars, economic collapses. They survived not because they maintained perfect distance, but because when crisis came, their people chose to support them rather than abandon them. And that choice was based on the conviction that royal leadership served the common good. Kate's voice grew stronger as she developed her argument. The question we face tonight isn't whether the monarchy should change, It's already changing, whether we guide that process or not. The question is whether it changes by becoming more connected to the people it serves or by becoming increasingly irrelevant to their lives. She moved back to her seat, but remained standing, addressing the council with the confidence of someone who had finally found her ground in this political battlefield. I believe the monarchy's future depends not on maintaining mystery, but on proving daily that royal privilege exists to serve rather than to be served, not on demanding respect, but on earning it through genuine commitment to the common good. The chamber fell silent as the fundamental choice crystallized before them. It wasn't really about Kate's approach to royal duties or Charles's support for his wife. It was about whether an ancient institution could transform itself radically enough to remain relevant in a democratic age, or whether the attempted transformation would destroy everything that made monarchy worth preserving. Camilla looked around the table at faces that had once offered automatic deference, but now showed the uncertainty of people genuinely wrestling with competing visions of the future. For the first time in 40 years, her authority was not just being questioned, it was being systematically dismantled by someone who had learned to use her own weapons against her. "Very well," she said finally, her voice carrying a cold finality that made everyone in the chamber pay attention. "If this council believes that popularity should triumph over principle, that innovation should override tradition, then you'll have the opportunity to see where that path leads. But don't expect me to remain silent while you conduct this experiment with an institution that's larger than any individual's vision." With that pronouncement, Camilla gathered her papers and walked toward the chamber's exit, her bearing still regal, but her political position fundamentally altered. The Queen Mother, who had entered the room as unquestioned authority, was leaving as just another voice in a debate about the monarchy's future, a voice that had been heard and, for the first time in decades, found wanting. As the chamber door closed behind her, Kate and Charles exchanged glances that mixed relief with apprehension. They had won this battle, but the war for the soul of the monarchy had only just begun. And in the corridors of power, where Camilla still commanded considerable influence, the consequences of this evening's confrontation were only starting to unfold. The revolution they had started was real, but revolutions, as any student of history knew, were easier to begin than to control.